Hello, everyone. Welcome to another installment of Janus Academy's series on historical analogies. This will be 22nd lecture in the series, and today we're going to be talking about abstraction and how it relates to minimalist art. On one end, we have abstract art, and then on the other, we have minimalism or minimalist art. I feel like I should precise this a little bit before we begin. We're talking about a very peculiar form of abstract art. This is going to be geometric abstract art, so we're not dealing with abstract expressionism. We are dealing with the very beginnings of abstract art. And then we're talking about that. We are taking a peculiar line of development here. We are not necessarily talking about the totality of abstract art, though we do kind of, but not really. We really want to focus on geometric abstraction, and if we're talking about major names that formed this particular movement, we are going to be focusing more on the line that's represented by František Kupka than the one that's represented by Kandinsky. Of course, not that these are the only two lines, but this is something that we decide to adopt as a method. When we're talking about this, we're of course going to be mentioning Malevich and Kandinsky, but Kupka is really the most important reference in this particular optics, because we see the connection between minimalist art and this particular form of abstract art. Now, it's a very interesting thing to address that abstract art, as we previously discussed in previous lectures, is quite specific. It's a very peculiar form of art. It's something that doesn't necessarily exist before. It's, I would argue, more revolutionary than some other previously existing stylistical formations, and I feel subjectively that this is a stylistical formation that has not been properly not just valued but also used. Now, I don't want to say exploited, but I think the term developed would be more adequate. This is something that still has a lot of potential for development, and this is something that is tremendously interesting and is tremendously potent in this regard. Now, the term potential is something that we're going to be coming back to. It's probably the key word for the entire lecture that we have today. Now, we want to talk about this whole thing that abstract art, this is going to be very important for today. Abstract art is a form of art that seeks to liberate itself from anything that is excessive. So in itself, it is fairly minimalist. It seeks to drop all the unnecessary weight, to shed all the fat, to say it metaphorically, and to really focus on what is truly important about painting or generally a work of art. We're going to be discussing a lot of statues today as well. And in this particular regard, we can see how it connects to minimalism, because it is obvious in the very name and the very appellation of the stylistical formation that it deals with something that is minimal. It deals with something that seeks focus. It doesn't seek a total or totalitarian vision of art. It seeks a very peculiar and very particular niche. And not just a niche, but really this idea that it wants to get to the core of what art is. And this is a very ambitious endeavor. We're going to explain why as we get along. It's very ambitious, amongst other things, because it places a tremendous amount of weight and focus on the spectator rather than on the artist. And this is something that is present throughout the 20th century. This is indeed something that begins in the second half of the 19th century, and something that profoundly has to do with modern art, with modernism in general, as well as postmodernism. Now, of course, we need to address the very simple fact that most of abstract art is modern, whereas all of minimalist art is postmodern. And we've addressed the difference between the two previously, so we're not going to go through all of that again. Suffice to say that this is a very important difference. It's the difference between optimism and pessimism, between construction and deconstruction, between the idea that we should build and we should hope and create, and on the other end, the idea that we should think and be cynical and deconstruct and question. So this is something that really plays into our understanding, and it definitely plays into creation of the works of art that we're going to be addressing today. Now, yet another difference is quite interesting. Actually, it's not so much a difference as it is a cyclical move. It's that abstract art originates in Western Europe. Well, arguably, you could say that some most important people like Kandinsky uh, go from Russia to Germany, then to France. So it's not really Western Europe, Russia, but you could say that Kandinsky has his glory days in Central and in Western Europe. Let's just say Europe. It's what really matters for this particular context. It doesn't really matter that much if it's Eastern, Central, or Western. But the important thing is that it's something that takes place in Europe. Now, this is relevant for our story because minimalism mostly takes place in the US. Now, of course, we have some European minimalist artists, but US, United States of America, is where the movement originates from. And then, of course, if we are looking at differences between Europe and America, we are looking at two cultural contexts that have a lot in common. They share a lot, but they have some key differences that play into what we're talking about today. And some of these differences, of course, are present and already explained in our previous lectures. The most important of them all deals with the time period that we're referring to. It deals with the fact that Europe lived through rather, and was profoundly marked and damaged by two world wars that took place in its territory. World War I and World War II. United States partook in World War I and II. They came out after both of these wars as the leading global superpower. If it was not entirely clear after World War I, it definitely was after World War II. So you could say that the main difference in this particular regard is that Europe after World War II was left in shambles, was left in ruins, with dozens of millions of people dead, and a lot more people damaged one way or the other, physically or spiritually or emotionally. Whereas the United States emerged as the victor of the war. They emerged with renewed economy, with newfound emphasis on industrialization, and truly as the industrial superpower of the world. So we're looking at two very different cultural contexts. We're looking at the victory of optimism, and we're looking at the empire of pessimism, if you will. We're looking at this whole idea that although part of Europe won World War II, the other considerable part lost the same war, it was still not a pleasant experience, far from it. Actually, it was incredibly traumatizing, even for the victors. And we covered this already, so we're not going to dwell on it too much. We're just going to stay with this when we're talking about how it affected abstract art and how it affected minimalist art. You could say that people creating in the realm of abstract art had very different surrounding, had very different context than people who created and formulated minimalist art. Now, there's yet another very important similarity next to this difference, and that is that both of these stilistical formations place a huge emphasis both on theory and on practice. And this is something that begins becoming a thing in the 20th century more and more and more. It was not that common back in the day. You could argue that in Renaissance we had people that were very polyvalent, people who had many different interests, like famously Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo, people who were painters and sculptors and dealt with music and dealt with architecture and wrote poems and invented weapons and many other things. Now, this is a very different situation than someone who deals with theory and practice, because you could argue that all the wonderful things that Leonardo have done were all in the realm of practice. He invented, he created a lot. He did not necessarily theorize quite that much. And this is a very different situation, because when you theorize on art, you take a completely different position than when you create art. And these are two very, very different things. They engage very different parts of your being. They necessitate different talents, different skills, different education even. You could say that while an art historian and a painter or a sculptor both deal with art, they're really not doing it in the same manner. And it's a kind of a peculiar thing. This is something that tells us a lot about art as such and how it changes in the 20th century, is that we start having more and more people who deal with both of these disciplines sometimes equally successfully, I would say. You could say that one of these people is Kandinsky, a very famous example, a very important example. You could say that people from the field of minimalism are in the same line. So Sol DeWitt is as important, I would say, as a theoretician as he was as an artist. You could say the same thing about Donald Judd. Perhaps he was more important as theoretician than he was as an artist. I'm not going to go into this speculation. He was equally important in both of these. Some people were relevant in this particular manner, not necessarily as theoreticians, meaning that they had very developed philosophical systems that they presented, that they had very developed aesthetics. Some of them gave a lot of statements. Some of them created cults of personality, like famously Salvador Dali, Andy Warhol, and many other people, Picasso, of course. These do not belong to these particular stylistical formations that we're talking about. We are now talking about really about generally the 20th century context and this idea that we have a blend of theory and practice. And this is quite peculiar because some of these stylistical formations in the 20th century truly invest themselves in theory quite heavily. We spoke about conceptual art, and it really is a lot about theory. So it's with abstract art that we start having this whole idea that theory becomes as important as practice, if not more so. And this is something that really communicates between these. Now, there's another striking similarity that I want to address, and it deals with a very peculiar case of Russia, rather the Soviet Union, really. Because in both of these cases, we are truly talking more about the Soviet Union than about Russia. However, people tend to equate because Russia was a big part of the Soviet Union and the creator of the Soviet Union and then later heir of the Soviet Union. So anyhow, we have this whole idea that Soviet Union, of course, is marked by the Bolshevik Revolution. It's marked by an entirely different system than the one that existed in the West. And with the entirely different set of values, mores, ideology, of course, and therefore the entire different take on art. So when we're talking about Russian influence on European art and then later on American art, we are, of course, talking about a very strong ideological input as well. We are not just talking about aesthetics. We will repeat again and again and again that aesthetics always carry ideology, even when people adopting those aesthetics are not aware of that. But aesthetics are always imprinted into ideology, and ideology is always imprinted, sometimes hidden, but necessarily carried by certain aesthetics. Now, this is important because when we're talking about abstract art, we are talking, of course, about Kandinsky as the major proponent. And we're talking about the fact that, well, he originated from the territory that would later be known as the Soviet Union. We are, of course, talking about Malevich and his participation in suprematism and constructivism and his immense influence on the 20th century as a whole. So we have the influence of this entire cultural context on European art. We have them being in contact, being in touch. And then after World War II, of course, with everything that happens with Soviet Union emerging in its own right as the global superpower number two, as a very influential state with incredibly influential culture, we have a very peculiar situation happening in America. Especially when it comes to minimalism, especially when it comes to this particular stylistical formation and the school of thought. And the thing I'm talking about is the so-called Sputnik era. This has a very cool appellation. So what happens is that the Soviets are the first one to launch a satellite into outer space, into orbit. And this is seen as a major breakthrough. This is seen as a phenomenal scientific and engineering and accomplishment in general. And of course, Americans are not very happy with this. They're not very happy with this because this is a part of the Cold War race. This is something that they see as a threat for national security. We don't know what these satellites can do, if they can be used for espionage, if they can be used for reconnaissance, many other things. So there is this air of uncertainty in the States. They're saying, look, these guys are communists, but they're doing incredibly well. They're winning the space race, which the Soviets were doing for a very long period of time. They had many other breakthrough achievements when it came to space that Americans were not able to catch up with, but that's a whole other story. So this is the moment where Americans start paying more attention to communist Soviet Union when they're saying, look, these guys have aces up their sleeves, they're technologically advanced. Perhaps their art is important as well. Perhaps they're not completely primitive or wrong, or whichever other stereotype was around when it came to Cold War view of the Soviet Union. So this was basically a moment of validation of Soviet Union, their industry, their development, their progressiveness, their scientific advancement, and of course arts always are a part of all of this. So this was also a way of them positioning themselves globally, and art of course has a role in all of it. So you could say that this is the moment where American artists start paying attention to what's going on in Soviet Union, and they start receiving some influences. They start considering this peculiar part of the world as something that is of considerable interest. And they start developing a type of art that is driven by this, that is influenced by this, that has a lot to do with objectivity, or has a lot to do with it as they see it. Now, this really also has to be connected, if we are to properly understand it, with American take in global confrontation between capitalism and communism, between the USA and the USSR. This, of course, has to do with creation of abstract expressionism. So if we want to properly understand minimalism and how it relates to geometric abstract art, we truly have to address abstract expressionism, because in many ways minimalism is intentionally created to be in opposition to abstract expressionism. It is something that is a reaction against. It is created for the sole purpose of opposing this peculiar type of art and saying that it should not be done that way. So when we say this, we say that abstract expressionism that we already addressed was focused, it had a laser focus on subjectivity. It was all about artists expressing themselves, and it was all about performance and creation of art, and the creation of art being more important than the material presence of art, whatever is left after the act of creation is over. So they are opposed to all of this. They seek objectivity, not subjectivity. They seek to value the object rather than all of the work that goes into the object. And they want to think about the material presence of object. They want to think about its qualities, about what makes it exist, what makes it be the way it is, how it behaves in space, how it interacts with space, how it interacts with light, with air, with shadows, with all these other things that constitute the material environment. They want to think about object in time. So you could argue on the other end of all of this is abstract expressionism, with its singular focus not only on subjectivity of the artist, but also of subjectivity enacted and subjectivity performed. So this in many ways is art that is created in opposition to. And of course, we can to a certain extent argue that abstract art, geometric abstraction, in a similar fashion is opposed to expressionism, but I would then say that it's not really opposed, it's more something that comes out of it and has a more complex relationship with it, especially if we think about Kandinsky, again, being, the very important figure in both of these. He was a very important figure in the Blautreiter group, as well as he was in the abstract art group. The thing we're trying to shed a light on here is really this notion of objectivity and subjectivity, and how it exists and how it behaves in the geopolitical historical context of its era. I find it interesting to address, of course, ideological and political sides of this, because we spoke about abstract expressionism being intentionally created by many important American institutions and some of their intelligence agencies as a vehicle of American values, and as something that was specifically created to celebrate individuality, subjectivity, capitalistic mode of production, Western idea of economy, Western idea of the world, of the individual, of the society, and all of those things. And then we have this other art current, minimalism, that seems to be going against all of these things. It seems to be coming from the same cultural context, but it carries all the different values and it inspires itself from the art of the enemy. I mean, because this is how Soviet Union was seen. It was the ideological enemy. They were engaged with Cold War. Any kind of war is not good. It's violent, be it cold or hot. So this is interesting because we are talking about a very political era. We are talking about the era that today seems hard to understand because today we still live in the remnants or the ruins, if you will, of the so-called post-ideological world. This is, of course, coming to an end, I would say, in a very abrupt manner. But it is still the case, at least in theory. Whereas, if we're talking about the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, really all up until the 90s of the 20th century, we are talking about a strongly ideological world where every action, and of course every artistic action, had its own ideological facet, aspect, and very important existence, very important ideological substance. And many works of art were indeed created but also interpreted in this manner. And we are talking about it because, as we said, in both abstract art and minimalist art, we have artists that live in ideological period, and we have artists who are more and more interested in theory. They are more and more theoreticians themselves. So I argue that this is something that was really important for us to properly understand this particular stylistical formation. Now, what I want to be addressing now is a bit of a personal experience, if you will, that I think a posteriori sheds a very interesting light, very important light on everything that we're talking about today. So what I want to address is the experience I had in 2016 when I traveled to United States of America and when I went to Texas, where I visited Marfa, the small town of Marfa, that up until, well, certain time was this incredibly small, lost in the middle of nowhere, former frontier town that had, I don't know, 150 inhabitants, not more. They had one theater, and this was kind of a miracle. And of course, they had historical evidence that they had a theater, I don't know, like 100 years ago or so. Yeah. Now, Marfa is an incredibly charming place, and I'm very happy to have visited. It is in the middle of nowhere, quite literally. If you want to get there, you have to travel through the desert for a very long time. And I cannot begin to stress just how important this feeling of absolute isolation how present it is in Marfa, because it really is very, very far from everything. Now, it does have a bit of a tourist attraction kind of a thing going on, I guess. It has Marfa lights that people like to connect to UFOs and all of that. But the reason why I'm talking about Marfa here is that they also have a Donald Judd Foundation. And you could argue that Marfa was almost entirely forgotten by the entire world until Donald Judd decided to settle there and decided to spend his remaining days there. After he was gone, after he died, a foundation was opened. And this foundation also acts as a museum to a certain extent. It has to do with the former military base that was in Marfa, so you can draw all sorts of symbolism out of that if you want to. And speaking of this whole intensely ideological context, I do have to mention that when I went to visit this former military base that was then transformed partially to Donald Judd Foundation, that I found walls and walls that were filled with communist paroles and communist graffiti and communist exclamations, which you would not expect that in the middle of Texas. Let's just put it that way. And you would certainly not expect that in the middle of Texas in 2016, but I guess you would even less expect it in the middle of Texas back in the 70s or 80s or 90s. But there they were. I'm going to try and find these photos in my personal archive. I'm going to put them in the video if I'm able to. But you can take my word for it. They were there in 2016. Not sure if they're still there. That's slightly besides the point. The point is that the opening of this foundation has placed Marfa on the map. And Marfa became this capital of hipsterdom, I would say, globally speaking. It became a very touristy, popular little town, and it became incredibly expensive on this account. This is a weird thing. You go to this little town in the middle of nowhere, and you can see very fancy hotels, you can see very fancy boutiques, you can see a lot more people than you would expect, and these people were all super hip. They were dressed as, you can imagine. And all of this was done by the presence of Donald Judd's foundation there. All of these people came just to be close to the foundation. Some of them moved to Marfa. Some of them started their businesses in Marfa. These swanky hotels, this artistic installation just outside of the city. There's a Prada boutique in the middle of the desert. That's another Marfa curiosity. So what I'm trying to address here is this interesting take that minimalism was very politically and ideologically aware. These artists were under influence from the Soviet Union, aesthetical, and then again, of course, ideological, even if they were not aware of it. But regardless of all of that, their existence and their work served to promote gentrification, because what was going on in Marfa was this very intense bout of gentrification. And just for those who are not familiar with the term, it is basically a process that is globally recognized to exist in 4 different stages. When you take a formerly working class or poor or popular, let's say a city or a town or a village or a part of the city rather, or a neighborhood, and then you fix it and then you bring it up, you start repairing buildings, you start making restaurants and gyms and bars and nightclubs and whatnot. And soon enough, this begins attracting hip young people. It starts attracting artists. Then artists attract other artists. Then they attract other young professionals. And before you know it, this is the very hip part of the city. It's no longer poor. It's now very popular. It's very chic. And of course, it becomes very expensive. Now, what this does, all of this sounds good up until a certain point. What this does in the long run is that it drives all the people that used to live in this neighborhood out, because they cannot afford it anymore. Rents go up, prices of everything go up, so people who previously lived there have to move to the periphery. They have to move further and further away. And you could argue that these neighborhoods, who attracted people on account of their authenticity or their quirkiness or their peculiarities, become more and more uniform and lose a lot of their substance. Now, we mostly talk about gentrification when we're talking about formerly industrial parts of the city, parts where we used to have factories or warehouses or storage units or any other economically productive neighborhoods, and that for specific reasons after the 70s have moved to the third world countries and remained vacant. So in many cases, gentrification happens to a previously economically not impoverished, but I would say disconnected and depopulated parts of the world, be it a city or a part of a city or a neighborhood. It doesn't really matter. And this is to a certain extent what happened to Marfa when Donald Judd decided to install his foundation there. Now, of course, one of the very important waves of gentrification is installation of artists. Artists attract other people because they're cool, they're hip, they have interesting ideas and whatnot. Now, I'm talking about this perhaps longer than I should because I find curious that gentrification is something that has strictly to do with capitalistic world, post-industrial perhaps rather than industrial. And it was driven by a person, Donald Judd, who was a very important minimalist artist, who was a very theoretically savvy individual. So he didn't really do things on accident. He didn't really do things out of the bloom. Quite the contrary. You could say that what is really important, not only about Donald Judd, but also about other people who created in this particular field, like we aforementioned Sol DeWitt or Robert Morris, Frank Stella. Their whole idea was to create in a deliberate manner. They wanted, again, to move themselves away from abstract expressionists who were all into frenzy and the sacred folly of creation and the struggle and pain and ecstasy and all these other things, dramatic things. No, these guys wanted to create in a very systematic, thought out, premeditated manner. For them, act of creation was more intellectual and cerebral than anything else. It was not this explosion of creativity. It was not this torment of trying to achieve a certain thing, whereas we don't really know what the thing we're achieving is. No, this is a very deliberate, conscientious effort. And if you're looking at art pieces that we're going to come to discuss, you can see that this is really the case. Now, you could say the same thing when it comes to inspiration for this peculiar type of art, for minimalist art. When we go back to abstract art, you can see that a lot of it is very meditative and a lot of it is deliberate. Now, this is where we come to understand why we insist on difference between Kandinsky on one end and Kupka on the other. If we look at Kupka's work, we can see that it's strongly geometric, that it has very strict, very clear and easy to understand harmonies, that it has mint compositions, whereas Kandinsky's paintings tend to look very chaotic. They don't necessarily invite us to look at its compositions and say, oh, this is phenomenally well made, this is phenomenally harmonious. There's a lot of chaos in a lot of Kandinsky's paintings, and of course this is not a flaw, this is done by design. But we're talking about a completely different approach. We're also talking about the approach that we can attribute to Mondrian. If we're looking at Mondrian and what he was doing, he was obviously paving the way towards minimalism, because he sought to create a painting with the least possible means used. If he could shed every possible color, he would do it. If he could shed all the forms that he did not need, he would do it. In the end, we know that paintings that Mondrian was most famous for were in most cases horizontal lines, vertical lines, and a couple of colors. Not too much. In most cases, it would be red and blue, and sometimes it would be yellow. So these paintings by Mondrian were very, very stern, and they were very, well, minimalist. We cannot really find a better term for it. They were very frugal, plastically speaking, visually speaking, and they were intentionally done this way. Now, you can understand that this is a completely different method and a completely different mind frame of creation than what Pollock was doing when he was throwing buckets of paint against the canvas, and when he was angrily trying to achieve the creative substance that he thought had to do with explosion of subjectivity and emotions and anger and all of the other things. No, this is a very, very sophisticated method of painting and of sculptor making, if we're talking about sculptor makers, that insists on a lot of patience and on a lot of measurement and on a lot of cerebral work. So it's very intellectual, and then you can understand it as such. Now, I want to address this particular approach to the general context of the 20th century. If we're talking about minimalism, we are talking about the stylistical formation that doesn't only exist, of course, in visual arts, it also exists in literature, and it exists in music, very importantly. And you could argue that some of these artists were very much connected, and they exchanged notes, they influenced one another. I will bring forth a reference from the world of literature that is very close to me. This is Samuel Beckett. He was involved in these circles. And you could say that what is interesting about Samuel Beckett is that in terms of literature, he grows out of theater of absurd, which, as we know, begins in the first half of the 20th century and shares a very similar trajectory with this whole conundrum that we are discussing now, with this connection between expressionism and abstract art on one end, and then abstract expressionism and how it connects to minimalism on the other. So there are connective tissues in all of this, and Beckett is in the middle of all of this. So we could say that all of these things point to a certain direction, and if you've been following these series, you will guess very easily that the direction in which they point is the medieval period. Yes, yet again we come back to the medieval period, and yet again we come back to this premise that 20th century art, generally speaking modern art, modern and postmodern, are profoundly medieval. Now, it is more present here than, I would say, arguably in any of the previous stylistical formations that we spoke about. And it is present in the most interesting manner, to me at least. Now, what I'm talking about here is this. What I'm talking about here is this situation that we have a work of art as presented in certain connection to divinity. We spoke about art before as having to do with sacred, or in the Christian optic, having to do with holy. And this was the case for, well, most of history. And then, of course, things started changing in the Renaissance. And then, of course, they changed even more dramatically after the French Revolution, when art started becoming secular. Now, these things change again when we get to the second half of the 19th century, and art starts becoming, I wouldn't say religious, but spiritual, kind of going towards religion. And it truly becomes medieval. Now, how is this the case with minimalist art? I want to go over this genesis of modern art so as to properly explain what I'm talking about. So we have, let's say, the first piece of modern art is generally considered to be Breakfast on Grass, Déjeuner sur l'herbe, or lunch on grass. Sorry, luncheon on grass. I think it's translated to English. For some reason, I remembered it as Breakfast on Grass, but it's luncheon on grass. So Déjeuner sur l'herbe by Manet. This is seen to be as the first modern work of art. Now, there are many reasons why this is the case. You could argue that partially it was intentionally poorly made, partially technique was lackluster intentionally. But what we're talking about here is this very peculiar aspect that this is the type of art that necessitates participation from the spectator. Now, what do I mean by this? If you want to truly understand this work of art, you have to invest a certain effort. You have to become a part of it. You are invited into this world. This work of art does not exist in its own separate realm where you just get to spectate upon it. No, you become a part of the work of art. You are involved. You are engaged. And this is something that begins with Manet. This is something that develops further and further, importantly with Cubism, because Cubism invites us to play around with forms that it throws at us. And then every sequent stylistical formation demands more and more out of the spectator and less out of the artist. Now, very quickly, following this line of development, we get to Duchamp and his fountain, to the famous urinal that he's presented, where he posits that there is nothing about the work of art. So you see, Manet started with saying, okay, not everything has to do with work of art, something has to do with the spectator. So there's some investment to be made on account of the audience as well. It's not just for the artist to create. Audience is there to create too. They are invited to become a part of the creative process. And very quickly, we get to this flipping point that is Duchamp, a very important reference, where he says, well, there's nothing in art, actually. In work of art, the work of art can be just about anything. So everything is with the spectator. Everything is with the audience. Now, he did not necessarily mean the individual spectator, perhaps like Manet had. He meant the community of spectators. So the general, let's say, artistic community, gallerists, theoreticians, art historians, etc. So it's their opinion that creates the work of art. Now, what does this does to a work of art? Well, it releases it from a lot of its substance. It releases it from a lot of its meaning. The work of art starts becoming an empty sign. And then you can see how the whole idea of conceptual art grows out of this when these people start thinking about art in this particular terms, in these terms. So they start thinking about the difference between the sign and what it represents, between the word and its true meaning. Not to get into all of that, we want to stay with this whole idea of potentiality of art. It's this whole idea that we start, let's say, with medieval painting or a statue, or even a pre-medieval. It doesn't have. It can be like archaic Greek sculpture. So this work of art is sacred. It stands for divinity, and it communicates 100% of its message. You are not there to interpret it. You are there just to bask in its glory. So let's say that participation of the audience is 0%, participation of the work of art is 100%. So we get to Manet and beginning of modern art. So participation of the work of art starts dropping and the participation of the audience starts growing. Now, I don't want to deal in percentages. This is incredibly hacky and not terribly serious, but you kind of get the point. Let's just be very descriptive and say that it gets to a 90% and then audience gets to the 10%. Now we get to cubism, analytical cubism. So it drops even further. Now let's say it's at 60% and participation of the audience is at 30%. And very quickly we get to Duchamp, who says, no, actually it's 0% on this end with a work of art, and it's 100% on this end with audience. So this flips the entire story very, very dramatically. And you can see how this changes the whole thing. Now, why do I argue that this is all profoundly medieval? Because we are talking, if we want to properly understand this premise, we need to go back to philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, where he speaks of the potentiality as a notion. He more accurately speaks of divine potentiality. St. Thomas Aquinas sees God, amongst other things, as pure potency, as pure potentiality. Why is this the case? Well, because God is not a material presence. God created the material world, but in itself, God is abstract and God is purely spiritual. It's a pure spirit. And as a pure spirit that is eternal, that is perfect, etc., it remains a perfect potency. It can be anything, and it can create anything. This helps to understand if you imagine money, the concept of money. I know, right? What a leap of logic from God to money. It's actually more connected than you think. If you have, let's say, a €100 bill in your hands, or 20 euros, doesn't really matter, or $20, whichever is easier, you can exchange that for goods and services. So you can say, okay, I have, let's say, €100, and that means that I can buy 100 liters of milk, or I can buy 100 loaves of bread, or I can have an hour of massage, or I can pay the gym for, I don't know, 2 months. You get the point. You have one certain quantity of money that has immense potentiality. You can do many different things with this one thing. You can exchange it. It can change its nature. Now, if you go and you buy 100 liters of milk, then you have 100 liters of milk. And this potentiality has been realized, it's over. Unless you want to bother and go resell these 100 liters of milk and make some money in return, then you are back to having pure potentiality. But if you stay with 100 liters of milk, that's it. You have 100 liters of milk, and potentiality of milk is far, far smaller than potentiality of money. So you could look at any work of art or any physical creation, really, a tree. You can look at a tree and say, okay, this tree can become a chair, or it can become a table, or it can become a pencil, or it can become a loom, or many other things that we use trees to make. Or we can just chop it up and use it to build fire. But once we do all of these things, we no longer have a tree. We've used the tree. And we can have remnants of tree once we build that fire, it turns to ashes. We can have a chair that can be functional or broken, but the tree is no longer there. Now, if we're talking about God, we are talking about pure potency, because God never transforms itself into matter, except that one time when it became Jesus Christ. But yeah, not to get into that. It's pure potency. God didn't stop existing when Jesus was created. He was still there. And St. Thomas Aquinas talks about God as this pure potentiality. And this is really important, because artists that act in realm of minimal art and stylistical formation of minimalism, they seek to have a work of art present potentiality. Now, not in its pure form, obviously, because they're not creating divinity, but they want the work of art to have more potentiality and less finitude, if I can put it this way. And you could argue that if you go back to the Renaissance painting, the example we keep having, this is, let's say, a painting, a very elaborate one, let's say Wedding Feast at Cana by Veronese. A very large painting, the largest painting in the Louvre, very complex, very detailed, sort of well-made, generally speaking, well-made. But yes, it is a painting that tells us a very interesting message, that has many different layers, that is visually very striking. But in terms of a work of art, its potentiality is pretty much at zero. In a different manner, in a different layer of communication, or if you will, in different strata of communication, this painting is very elaborate and has a lot to share. It has a lot to communicate. It has a lot to offer. But in this particular strata that deals with potentiality, well, it's a painting, right? And it's done. It has finished its life as such. these artists seek to create works of art that have greater potentiality, and they seek to approximate divine potentiality that St. Thomas Aquinas is talking about. And you can argue that what we were talking about, the genesis of modern art, where we have meaning be situated with the work of art on one end, and then meaning be situated with the congregation, if you will, the community of spectators. You could not only observe this as meaning and the capacity for interpretation, you can also observe it as potentiality in this particular key when we talk about St. Thomas Aquinas and how he saw it. Now, I would like to give another example that comes from a completely different spiritual context and cultural context, and I think this is quite interesting because we are talking about second half of the 20th century. We're talking about world that is increasingly globalized, and I generally think that it's useful for us to decontextualize these stories here and there so that we could better understand them. So the example I want to give is that of Lao Tse, the famous Taoist or Taoist sage, and his very simple yet incredibly deep statement that the bowl is most useful when it's empty. Yeah, take a moment to contemplate that. So you can fill a bowl with rice, or you can fill it with water, or you can fill it with meat. It doesn't really matter. You can fill it with anything you want, and it has a certain use. Let's say I'm thirsty, I want to have a bowl of water. I fill it with water, great, I have satiated my thirst. But if this bowl remains unfilled, it remains with its potentiality unblemished, and it's more useful empty than it is full, because if we put water inside, we cannot put rice inside, nor we can put meat, nor we can put paint or any other thing that we want to pour into a bowl. So you see what I'm saying here, and you understand how this art, minimalist art, that is by design and by definition incredibly simple, is basically oriented at a very different goal. Its goal is to explore the realm of potentiality rather than to give us a definitive finite version of whichever message it is interested in communicating. So this is something that is really, really important to understand. Now, we also want to understand the peculiarity of minimalist art, that although it has this very medieval, very spiritual ambition to embody potentiality, it stays quite formal. Now, this is the very interesting thing about minimalism, is that it seeks to bring these two very, very opposed realms together. It seeks to bring formality and materiality and the material presence and material essence of the object together with these highly spiritual, highly abstract, and indeed highly conceptual forms. Now, you could argue that one of the key influences that has shaped the stylistical formation of minimalism is, of course, conceptual art, and its focus on concept rather than on the finite work of art itself. But minimalist art seeks to define itself as opposed to conceptual art. This is quite interesting because if you're to look some of the pieces of conceptual art and some of the pieces of minimalist art, you would say, well, this look tremendously similar. However, they are profoundly different because minimalist art remains quite formal. It is spiritual to a certain extent, but it is also very, very formal because it is so invested in the material essence and the material presence of the object. Truly, it goes very deep into material presence and material qualities of any given object. And it mostly deals with simple objects, as you would surmise from the appellation, because it wants to, focus on them. It has this magnifying glass approach. It insists on the tendency that we've already mentioned, dealing with other stylistical formation, the tendency that defines the 20th century, and this is exactly to focus on, to simplify, to shed whatever we see as unnecessary, and really inspect this one particular trait or quality or tendency or impulse or which have you. So I hope I've made it clear that there is a strong connection with people like Piet Mondrian and Vasily Kandinsky and Kazimir Malevich on one end, and people like Donald Judd and Sol DeWitt and Robert Morris and the others on the other. They have their differences, but they have their similarities. And of course, František Kupka, again, is the most important connection between these two realms. Now, I want to also concentrate on this unifying syncretic and I would say amalgamatory, sorry for the sorry for the unnecessary complicated expression, tendency that exists in minimalist art, which is quite peculiar and quite curious because we just said it's all about simplification and it's all about focus. But at the same time, it is about bringing things together syncretically. It's about bringing the concept and the material presence of an object together. It's about also bringing painting and sculpture together. You could argue that there exists this general tendency that we just previously discussed to focus on things and to separate and categorize and stratify different disciplines, different domains. We've gave the example of medicine, where perhaps back in the day, many centuries ago, if you were a physician, you would just heal people, and that's what you've done. But then with specialization, you started focusing on lesser and lesser parts of human being, and you would heal only those body parts. You would not know what to do with other ones. Now, we have this general tendency continue in the 20th century. I was going to say explode. But with minimalism, we also have this tendency to merge things together. So to try and erase the differences between painting and sculpture, to try and erase the differences between conceptual art and formal art, and to bring those together. So it's really interesting to mention the presence of people like Sol DeWitt, who was a very important figure in minimalist art, but also a fundamentally important figure in conceptual art. He exists in both of these realms, and I would argue that he is equally important for both of them. We have this general tendency to bring them together. Now, I want to go through these artists that I think are very important for the movement, so we don't have a lot of time left, as I see on the clock there, so I'll try to be concise about this. I've already mentioned the name Donald Judd. He is really one of the progenitors of the movement and a very important reference. He deals with this whole idea that art should be objective, as we said, but objective in a manner that it's supposed to evoke the absence of artist, not its presence. Now, this is again very interesting because it takes us back to the early medieval period when artists would not necessarily sign their work. They were not deemed important as individuals. It was their work that was made to honor and glorify and worship God that was important. Their persona was not. Donald Judd has a similar tendency not to sign his work, but to basically abstract artists out of it. And you can see again how this is a reaction to abstract expressionism that is all about the persona of the artist. This is to be a completely different thing, an opposite thing, to be completely against the persona of the artist. And he seeks to use industrial materials. He seeks to focus on something that is therefore artificial. And he seeks to really bring this forward with the specific focus on how the object exists in space. He does this through repetition. He does this through ever so slight changes to the object that he repeats. And he does this by thinking very deeply about what he does and inviting us as his audience to do the same. Now, again, I can go back to my experience of visiting his foundation in Marfa, and I can tell you that there's a very large hangar, formerly military hangar, that was adapted into an exhibition space where they presented, if I'm not mistaken, 200 cubes that were made of aluminium or some other, well, highly polished metal. Perhaps they were steel. Sorry, Donald Judd. So yeah, these cubes were all very similar and they all looked alike. They had slight differences between them. Sometimes differences were quite obvious, sometimes they were not terribly obvious. But the whole idea, of course, is that of repetition, artificiality, and again, absence of artists. So the object is the thing that matters. The object is the thing that is to invoke its presence, to affirm its presence, and it's there to inspire our thought. Now, if we think about what we just said about potentiality, it makes sense that the object needs to be as simple as possible so as to allow for more space for contemplation. Now, I want to address Sol DeWitt, and since we're talking about cubes, of course, he is the cube person, perhaps more than cubists were. He is really important on account of cubes because he seeks to simplify objects as much as he possibly can. So he is not satisfied by creating a singular cube, a very simple cube. He wants to go above that. What do you do to simplify that even more? If you think about the cube as, well, a very simple shape to begin with, and if you think about symbolism of the cube, I need to really address this really quickly because we have the whole idea that the cube is basically a three-dimensional representation of the square, the same way that a sphere is a three-dimensional representation of a circle. Square and a circle are very spiritually and religiously important shapes. The one deals with the material realm, the other deals with the heavenly spiritual realm. So if you deal with squares or cubes, you are dealing very specifically with the material realm, and you are underlining that. If you deal with cubes as an artist, it's as if you're saying, I want to deal with what is material. I don't really care about spiritual quite as much. On the other end, if you want to bring the two together, then you create, well, a basilica where you have a cubic foundation and then a semicircular, semi-spherical rooftop. So in this particular case, we have Sol DeWitt trying to further simplify the cube, and so he creates cube skeletons, if you will. So basically just a frame of a cube. And he has a series of these. He has basically many different takes on this particular notion. Now, what Sol DeWitt does is that he also invests himself in this notion that artist is not alone in their creation. So you can see the influences of constructivism and suprematism here. What Sol DeWitt does is that he borrows to a certain extent from conceptual art, and he creates art by giving instructions. He gives instructions to his assistants or even to spectators, even to the audience, on how to create drawings or how to create works of art. And you can see the clear connection with conceptual art. You can see how the two come together in this. And of course, these instructions are very simple. They're not terribly complex. Yeah, they're not terribly complex. Let's stay with that. Now, in this particular regard, you have this whole idea of process being less important than the finished work of art. You can see how this is a direct jab at abstract expressionism. And you can see how there are parts of minimalism that are not necessarily all about symmetry and harmony and geometry. If we're talking about Frank Stella, for example, his paintings are all about geometry. So we can see that what he is doing, he is seeking geometric harmonies, he is seeking geometric expressions, but that is not always the case. If we go back to Sol DeWitt and his drawings or his murals, his wall drawings, he has a lot of those, you can see repetitive patterns, but that are not terribly geometric, they're not terribly strictly structured. Now, what Robert Morris does, what he is famous for, is that he takes felt, and he basically cuts it or tears it into pieces and then drops those pieces to create an assembly out of pieces of felt. And this is something that he does anew every time when he goes to another gallery. So another thing that he does is that he creates smoke installations. This is quite interesting. A statue made of smoke. You can understand, of course, that a statue made of smoke or pretty much anything made of smoke is not going to last for a very long time. And this is also the case with felt, because as we said, it is to be done anew every time it goes to another gallery. What is happening here is a very important part of minimalist art that is, of course, also very spiritual and takes us, again, back to the realm of spirituality, be it medieval Christian from Europe or being a Buddhist or being Taoist. So what we're dealing with here is this whole idea of ephemerality of art. And we're dealing with this idea that art is not built for eternity. Art is built for its moment. It's built to be, well, to exist in time. And of course, we're not going to go through the whole Heideggerian aesthetics and philosophy. We're just going to mention it, that it has a lot to do with that entire context. So what he is doing, Robert Morris, is that he introduces these ephemeral pieces and he focuses on form. It's really reintroduction of formalism, and it's reintroduction of our observation of time. We are to observe these things. We are to think about them. We are to immerse ourselves in it. And you can see that, again, we are using something very, very simple to convey this message. Now, I see that our time is past. We are a couple of minutes over what we were supposed to do. So I really just want to bring all of this together. And I want to not only create a historical analogy between between abstract art and minimalism, between the beginning of the first half of the 20th century and the second half of the 20th century. I also want to create a very linear line of development that not only has to do with growing potentiality in the work of art, but also with growing spirituality of the work of art. And in this particular regard, I want to address another artist, Yves Klein, a rather well-known artist who also created in the realm of minimalism. You can clearly see how Yves Klein continues the line of development that was introduced by Malevich and Kandinsky and Mondrian. There's an entire visit of Pompidou that you can do talking just about these artists and how they are chronologically and thematically aligned and how they form a very solid bond, a very solid connection, that they seek to simplify and make their art more and more spiritual and more potential in the key that we previously described. Now, if you look at Kandinsky's art, you can say that he presents a lot of fairly diverse colors and forms and lines. They are, of course, abstract in nature if we're talking about mature Kandinsky. But he does use a lot of lines and he does use a lot of colors. There's a lot of variety in this regard. On the other end, you get to go to Malevich. You see that it becomes way simpler. He considerably simplifies these things, and he continues with a very strict, simple, and minimalist expression. And then you get to Mondrian, and you see how Mondrian simplifies even further, though arguably you cannot really simplify further than the black square, but he does have other works, Malevich, not just the black square. So Mondrian, in most of his paintings, only uses two colors. We cannot say that black and white are colors. Technically, they're not. So he only uses red and blue and sometimes yellow. And then you see that Yves Klein is very famous for only using one color. So he drops red and white and blue, and red, white, and black. And he only goes with blue. So you can see some statues that are done by Yves Klein. You can see a lot of canvases that are just covered in blue. And sometimes it would be a white canvas that has splashes of blue paint, but in many other cases it will just be a canvas that is done in blue. And you could say, okay, what's the big deal? It's a canvas that's monochrome. It's done in one color. Well, the deal is that it's his blue. He created it, he developed it, so there's the whole thing with that. But it's also a thing that reminds us of the potentiality of the work of art and everything that we can develop out of it. That the simpler the work of art is, the greater our space for imagination and for creative effort on our end is. Now, I think what really helps us to understand this particular tendency and just how spiritual and again how medieval and how religious it really is to see works of art done by Yves Klein that are blue and gold, that go back to the Byzantine color scheme and to go back truly to the interior of most Byzantine churches. It is only with this in mind that we get to properly understand and to properly situate Yves Klein and minimalism in general, and of course how it grows out of abstraction. So I would use this as a conclusion. Think about divinity in art and think about how divinity becomes an incredibly important topic in 20th century art, especially in the second half of the 20th century when art is supposed to be incredibly secular and fashionable and dandy and decadent and all of those things. Yes, it really is the case. I hope this made sense. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again soon. Have a nice day. Ciao.